In the summer of 1816, the world forgot what warmth felt like. Snow fell in June, crops withered in July, and the sun, pale and distant, seemed to vanish behind a sky of ash. Across Europe and North America, people called it the year without a summer. They didn't know it then, but a volcano on the other side of the world had changed the course of their lives. Entire harvests failed, rivers froze in midsummer, and hunger spread through towns that had never known famine. This is not a story of disaster, but of endurance, of how ordinary people faced a year when nature itself seemed to turn against them, and still found ways to survive. So, settle in. Let's step back to a year when daylight dimmed and hope burned quietly in the cold. And if you enjoy traveling through forgotten corners of history like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. In the early months of 1816, the people of Europe expected spring as they always had. The snows of winter melted slowly from the fields. Birds began to return from the south, and farmers prepared their plows. After years of war and hardship, they hoped for peace and for warmth, but the skies above them had other plans. March came and went in gray silence. The days grew longer, but the sun seemed weak, as though a veil had been drawn across the sky. Mornings were misty, afternoons dim. The air had a strange chill that never quite lifted. At first, people thought it was only a late season, one more stubborn winter refusing to leave. But as weeks turned to months, unease began to spread. By May, the chill had deepened into cold. Frost touched the edges of the fields, killing early sprouts. Streams froze overnight in the mountain valleys. In parts of France, the Rhone ran thick with slush. In England, farmers lit fires around orchards to keep the blossoms from dying. But the smoke only added to the haze that already hung over the land. And then, in June, the month when the earth should have been green, it snowed. Reports came from Switzerland, Germany, and Ireland, flakes falling over meadows, covering young crops, whitening rooftops. In some places, it fell for days. In others, thunder rolled above frozen ground, lightning flashing against a gray afternoon sky. The weather made no sense. One moment the air was warm enough to melt the snow. The next it froze again. In diaries from that year, the words repeat: dark, cold, endless, strange. People began to notice that the light itself had changed. The sun was no longer gold but dull and copper-colored, dim even at midday. The sunsets burned red and violet, long and eerie. Travelers described the world as if it were trapped beneath tinted glass, and one could have known that. A year earlier, on the far side of the globe, Mount Tambora, a massive volcano in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, had exploded with unimaginable force. The eruption in April 1815 sent dust and ash high into the stratosphere, where winds carried it across the entire planet. The fine particles reflected sunlight back into space, cooling the Earth by nearly 1 degree, enough to change everything. But in 1816, people did not yet understand global weather or volcanic impact. They only saw what was before them: failed crops, cold rain, and skies that refused to clear. In England, the poet Lord Byron looked out at Lake Geneva that summer and wrote, "The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space." His words captured what many felt, that something vast and unnatural had dimmed the world. Farmers across Europe faced ruin. Wheat and barley failed to ripen. Oats, the main food for horses, withered in the fields. Without oats, transport and trade slowed to a crawl. Prices doubled, then tripled. In Germany, bread riots broke out as families fought to buy what little grain remained. In Ireland, people turned to fishing and foraging, gathering seaweed along the coasts and nettles from the roadsides. In Switzerland, snow-covered mountain passes even in August. Rivers overflowed, drowning the crops that frost had spared. Desperate villagers slaughtered livestock early, unable to feed them through a season that felt like winter in disguise. North America fared little better. In New England, June brought frost thick enough to break the earth. Farmers awoke to find corn blackened and dead, their orchards ruined. By July, they had replanted, only to lose everything again in another freeze. Some gave up entirely, loading wagons and heading west, hoping to find a climate that still obeyed the calendar. In Canada, snow fell in Quebec and Montreal through early summer. Lakes froze again before autumn. People huddled indoors, burning whatever they could find: furniture, old fences, even tools, to keep warm. Letters from the time speak of a strange fog that dimmed the daylight, of nights that never ended, of ice in July. Even as people struggled, they tried to make sense of what was happening. Some blamed the eruption of distant volcanoes they had heard rumors of. Others blamed the sun itself. Perhaps its fire was dying, they said. In New England, a theory spread that the Earth's axis had shifted. Newspapers published wild speculations. Comets, divine wrath, the end of the world. But most people simply endured, with no explanation, only cold. By midsummer, hunger began to bite. Food stocks that had survived the Napoleonic Wars were nearly gone. Across Europe, governments opened emergency granaries and rationed what they could. In France, soup kitchens served thin broth to long lines of citizens. In Germany, bakeries began mixing ground straw or sawdust into bread to stretch supplies. In Ireland, potatoes, the one crop that could usually be relied upon, rotted in the soil from endless rain. Still, people adapted. Fishermen spent longer at sea. Hunters scoured forests for game. Mothers boiled nettles and dandelion leaves into bitter stews. Children collected acorns and ground them into flour. There was little joy, but there was endurance, a quiet will to survive. In the Swiss countryside, families shared what little they had. One diary from a small village near Interlaken recorded that the schoolteacher divided his salary in half to feed hungry students. A local blacksmith worked without pay, mending plows for neighbors who could no longer afford tools. Those who lived near lakes dug small gardens on raised ground, hoping the reflected light would coax a few vegetables to grow. The cold also reshaped society in unexpected ways. With crops failing and markets empty, people turned to creativity. In Geneva, the same gloomy weather that ruined farms kept a group of travelers indoors. Among them, Lord Byron and a young woman named Mary Shelley. There, trapped by the endless rain of 1816, she began writing a story that would later become Frankenstein. Out of the darkness, imagination found form, but beyond art and literature, life for most remained defined by scarcity. Diseases spread through malnourished populations. In some towns, smallpox and typhus returned, carried by refugees wandering in search of food. In others, families shared a single loaf of bread for days. And yet, amid the hardship, there were moments of quiet strength. In letters and journals, a different tone sometimes appears, one of endurance rather than despair. A Swiss farmer wrote, "We plant again, though we know the frost will come. It is better to hope than to starve waiting." The skies did not clear quickly. Through the end of 1816 and into 1817, the world remained colder than before. Ice lingered on rivers into late spring. The harvests that followed were meager, but better. Slowly, the planet warmed again as the volcanic dust settled and sunlight returned to full strength. By 1818, people spoke of the lost summer as a memory, a time when they had learned how fragile the rhythm of the world could be. The scientists of later centuries would measure the eruption of Mount Tambora as one of the largest in recorded history. Its ash clouds circled the globe, dimming the sun for more than a year. It lowered global temperatures by more than a degree, disrupted rainfall, and reshaped agriculture for seasons to come. But to those who lived through it, it was not a scientific event. It was personal. It was the sound of empty markets, the sight of frozen fields, the taste of bread stretched too thin. It was waking up each morning and finding frost where flowers should have been. And perhaps that is why this story still matters. Because it reminds us that history is not only the record of kings and wars, but of ordinary people, farmers, mothers, merchants, who endured what they could not explain. When the summer never came, they did not surrender. They adapted, shared, and survived as the years passed. Their memory faded into folklore, the year without a summer. A phrase that sounds almost poetic until you realize it was a year without warmth, without color, without comfort. Yet it was also a year of quiet strength, when humanity learned once again that endurance begins not with certainty, but with persistence. The fields eventually turned green again. The rivers thawed, and the sunlight returned. But for those who lived through 1816, summer would never feel quite the same again. Long before the strange summer of 1816, the story had already begun on a small, distant island thousands of miles from Europe in the Dutch East Indies, known today as Indonesia. There, in April 1815, a mountain named Tambora changed the course of the world without anyone realizing it. The island of Sumbawa was quiet that spring. Farmers tended rice fields, fishermen worked the coast, and the volcano that rose above them, more than 4,000 meters tall, had slept for centuries. But in early April, the ground began to tremble. A low, distant rumble echoed across the island. People looked toward the mountain and saw smoke rising from its summit. Thin at first, then thicker, darker, heavier. On April 5th, the first explosion came. The sound carried more than 1,000 kilometers away. Sailors at sea heard it and thought it was cannon fire from a distant war. The mountain spat ash and fire into the sky, but after a few days, the tremors faded. People began to return to their routines. They could not know that the worst was yet to come. 5 days later, on the evening of April 10th, 1815, Mount Tambora erupted again, this time with a force unmatched in modern history. The explosion was so violent that it could be heard nearly 2,000 kilometers away. Ships hundreds of miles distant were showered with ash. The top of the mountain, nearly half its height, disintegrated, collapsing inward and sending a column of gas and debris more than 40 kilometers into the atmosphere for 3 days. Darkness fell across the surrounding islands. Ash rained down in heavy sheets, burying entire villages. The sea boiled near the coast. The air filled with sulfur and dust so thick that even torches could barely pierce it by the time the eruption ended. More than 100,000 people across the region had lost their lives, not only to fire and ash, but to famine and disease in the months that followed. Crops failed, livestock died, and water sources were poisoned. The explosion had unleashed more than 100 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, enough to change the world's climate for years. But in 1815, there was no global communication, no satellites or weather stations. Europe and America would not hear of Tambora for months, and even then, few understood its scale. To those far away, the world simply grew dimmer and colder. Without explanation, in the months after the eruption, the volcanic cloud began its slow journey around the globe. High in the stratosphere, particles of ash and sulfur dioxide spread into a fine haze that drifted with the upper winds. Within weeks, the skies above India and China grew pale. Within months, the haze reached Europe. Unlike the ash that falls to Earth after a local eruption, these particles were too small to settle quickly. They remained suspended in the upper atmosphere, reflecting sunlight back into space. The result was a global cooling that few would notice at first, a subtle dimming of light, a soft drop in temperature. But the change was already in motion. By late 1815, sunsets across the world began to turn extraordinary colors. Travelers and painters described skies of deep red, orange, and violet. Artists in England and Germany captured the strange light in their work. skies that glowed unnaturally bright at dusk, clouds lined with fire, horizons tinted with copper. It was beautiful, but it was the beauty of distortion. Scientists today estimate that the average global temperature dropped by nearly 1 degree Celsius in 1816, a small number on paper, but catastrophic in reality. That single degree shortened growing seasons, froze rivers, and shifted rainfall patterns across continents in Asia. Monsoons failed, leading to droughts that spread hunger across India and China. In Europe, the chill turned summer to winter. In North America, frost struck again and again. Even in June at the time, no one could connect these events. The world was too large, too slow in its exchange of knowledge. Each region believed its suffering was local, a strange weather year, a turn of bad luck. No one realized that a single mountain, half a world away, had cast its shadow over them all. For the people of Sumbawa, the mountain's fury was immediate and absolute. The kingdom of Tambora, once thriving, was erased. Archaeologists who later excavated the site found houses, pottery, and skeletons buried in layers of volcanic ash, a landscape frozen in the moment of disaster. Like Pompeii before it, Tambora had preserved tragedy in silence. The local survivors described what they saw as a rain of fire. Boats along the coast were swept inland by tsunamis. Fields disappeared beneath meters of ash. In some regions, the ground remained hot for weeks. The survivors fled to neighboring islands, carrying stories of endless darkness and skies that glowed at night. Beyond Indonesia, sailors recorded the effects for months. The British ship Benares logged that the air was filled with fine dust, making breathing difficult. Others reported that daylight was faint and stars were invisible at night due to the haze by the time the cloud reached the northern hemisphere. The change was invisible but inescapable. Sunlight dimmed, the air cooled, and the rhythm of the seasons faltered in Europe. This shift arrived quietly at first. The winter of 1815 to 1816 was long and cold, but not extraordinary. It was spring and summer that revealed the scale of what had happened. Crops that had once thrived failed to sprout. Snow fell in June, frost-coated fields in July, and as harvests withered, fear took root. Letters from the time reflect confusion and disbelief. A farmer in Austria wrote, "The days are colder than any winter I remember, and the nights are endless." In America, a diary entry from Vermont described, "A gray sun at noon and ice thick enough to bear weight in June." But while the people of Europe and America struggled to make sense of the cold, naturalists began to notice patterns. In Switzerland, Jean de Charpentier, an early geologist, observed that the sunsets had changed color and suspected that something large had filled the air. In India, British colonial officials recorded failing monsoons and disease outbreaks, unaware they were linked to the same event. Only decades later would scientists connect the pieces. In the 1880s, after studying global temperature records and volcanic ash deposits, they realized that the eruption of Mount Tambora had caused what modern climatology now calls a volcanic winter. It was the largest eruption in at least 1,500 years, 10 times greater than Krakatoa's explosion in 1883. Its impact was so vast that it reduced sunlight across the entire planet for more than a year. It also inspired some of the most haunting works of art in history: Turner's paintings, Byron's poetry, and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, all born in the strange twilight of that year. But beyond art and science, Tambora's legacy was human. It changed lives silently, without warning. It reminded the world that nature's reach extends far beyond what the eye can see. In the Dutch archives, one report written months after the eruption reads simply, "The mountain has vanished." What once towered over Sumbawa was reduced to a caldera, a vast hollow rimmed with cliffs and filled with quiet mist. Grass would grow there again, and trees would return, but the memory remained in the land itself. Today, Mount Tambora stands at half its original height. Its crater spans more than 6 kilometers, a silent monument to the scale of what once happened. Scientists still find traces of that event in ice cores taken from Greenland and Antarctica, thin layers of ash marking 1815, like a scar across the Earth's memory. And perhaps that is what makes Tambora's story remarkable. It was unseen, yet inescapable. It did not roar through battlefields or crumble empires, yet it reshaped the planet more profoundly than any war of its age. The people who lived under its shadow did not think of history or science. They thought of lost homes, empty fields, and gray skies. But through them, the world learned a quiet truth: that even distant mountains can touch every life, that the Earth's smallest particles can cool the warmth of nations, and that silence, the kind that follows an eruption, can echo across years. When we speak of 1816 as the year without a summer, we are really speaking of Tambora, of a moment when the world exhaled dust, and humanity felt it as cold. And though the years have long since passed, the volcano's shadow remains, not in the sky, but in memory. It reminds us that the boundaries of cause and effect stretch far beyond what any one lifetime can see. By the summer of 1816, the Earth had forgotten its rhythm. Across the fields of Europe, seeds that had once promised abundance now lay still beneath the cold soil. The rains came too often, and when they stopped, frost returned. In a world that had depended for centuries on the steady cycle of the seasons, that year felt like betrayal. Farmers who had survived wars, droughts, and taxes could do little against a sky that refused to warm. In England, wheat fields yellowed before ripening. In France, vineyards shriveled under unexpected frost. In Switzerland, mountain slopes that should have been green in June were covered in snow. The old rhythms of life, planting, growing, harvesting, had collapsed. And with them, so too did the certainty that tomorrow would be better than today. The failure began quietly. In early spring, as the soil thawed, farmers planted as they always had. But the nights stayed cold. Frost coated the ground again and again, burning the fragile seedlings before they could take root. By May, replanting had become a gamble. Each morning began with the same cautious glance toward the horizon. Would the sun appear, or would the clouds return? In France, the Ministry of Agriculture sent word that harvests might fall by half. In Ireland, where potatoes were the main crop, damp weather brought rot to the soil. The smell of decay clung to the air. In the German states, rye and barley failed entirely. Families began to sell livestock to buy what little grain remained as summer arrived and brought no warmth. Prices climbed. A loaf of bread that had cost a few sous the previous year now cost 10. Oats, the food not only for people but for horses, rose to record prices. Without horses, transport slowed. Without transport, markets emptied. The chain of survival broke link by link. By July, hunger had spread faster than any government could control. In southern Germany, peasants gathered at the edges of towns, pleading for work or food. In some cities, bakeries were guarded by soldiers to prevent riots. In France, newspapers reported desperate thefts of flour and corn from warehouses. In Ireland, families left the countryside for coastal towns, hoping to find fish or charity. Hunger does not announce itself all at once. It begins as weakness, then as fatigue. It becomes the sound of quiet kitchens, the smell of thin broth, the silence of children too tired to play in the Swiss canton of Vaud. One teacher wrote, "I no longer mark the seasons by the weather, but by the faces of my pupils. Their cheeks grow thinner each week." The loss of food was not the only hardship. The unending rain ruined hay meant for animals, leading to shortages of milk and meat. Firewood became scarce, as the forests were cut down to keep homes warm through the cold nights of midsummer. The sound of axes replaced the songs of harvest. Still, people adapted in ways both practical and inventive. In the Alps, villagers dug terraces into higher slopes, hoping to catch more sunlight. In Germany, bakers mixed barley, peas, and even powdered acorns into flour. In France, the government encouraged the use of potatoes where possible, though the crop itself often failed. In some places, people learned to boil grass and wild herbs into stews. Even city dwellers felt the weight of the cold. In London and Paris, chimneys smoked day and night. Coal, already expensive, became nearly unattainable for the poor. The fog that hung over cities was thick with soot and damp. Markets that once bustled with trade now echoed with emptiness. In Ireland and Scotland, coastal communities survived by turning to the sea. Fishermen spent longer hours in their small boats, often risking storms to bring back catches of cod and herring. Women dried seaweed for food. Children gathered mussels and limpets along the rocks. Hunger made people resourceful, but it also made them vulnerable. In North America, the story was similar. Farmers in New England watched their corn freeze black in June. They planted again, and frost came again in July. Some families abandoned their farms altogether and moved westward, toward the Ohio Valley, where the soil was rich and the air slightly warmer. The Great Migration of that year, quiet, desperate, and unplanned, reshaped the settlement of the United States. One settler from Vermont later wrote, "We left not for fortune, but for weather. We followed the warmth as one follows a rumor. The hardship crossed borders, but it also crossed classes. In Europe's great cities, even the wealthy felt the cold. Gardens that once bloomed with flowers turned brown. Carriages splashed through frozen mud. Ice formed on rivers that had not frozen in centuries. The poor suffered most, but the discomfort reached all levels of society. Amid the despair, communities began to rediscover cooperation. Churches opened storehouses. Town councils organized soup kitchens. In the small German town of Eisenach, a group of merchants banded together to buy grain in bulk and sell it at cost to the hungry. In rural France, neighbors shared seed and livestock, trading not with money but with trust. It was a slow lesson in endurance, one that stretched through every household, every village, every tired face. And yet, there were glimpses of resilience that no frost could extinguish. In the mountains of Switzerland, travelers recorded the sound of bells echoing through snow-covered valleys in midsummer, not from celebration, but from small processions of people giving thanks simply for surviving. In England, journals from farmers' wives mention that families began saving tiny portions of seed despite knowing the odds were low. Hope, it seemed, was stubborn. The weather showed no mercy. The cold rain continued through August and into September. In the Scottish Highlands, flocks of sheep starved for lack of grass. In Bavaria, hailstorms destroyed what little grain had survived. In Ireland, whole families walked miles to market towns to sell anything they could, blankets, tools, even heirlooms, for a handful of meal. Diseases soon followed. Weakened bodies fell to fever and infection. In the damp cities of Europe, outbreaks of typhus spread through overcrowded shelters. Yet even then, life continued in quiet, ordinary ways. Blacksmiths repaired tools, teachers taught lessons, and farmers, though hopeless, still sowed seed, if only out of habit. Autumn came late and cold. Snow fell in October. When the final harvests were gathered, they were meager, but not nothing. Across Europe, people counted what they had, not enough to thrive, but enough to survive. The winter of 1816 to 1817 would be long, but they were prepared in spirit if not in strength. In the aftermath, letters and newspapers began to speak not only of hardship, but of gratitude. One Swiss farmer wrote, "We have lost our crops, but not our courage. We will plant again, for even the sky cannot stay dark forever." The following spring, when the first signs of warmth returned, people were cautious. They planted later, watched the skies carefully, and stored every bit of grain they could. Slowly, the balance began to return. Historians now estimate that 1816 caused one of the worst famines in 19th century Europe. Yet it also revealed something profound, that in every corner of that cold world, people found ways to endure. They shared, adapted, and waited. In that endurance, there was dignity. In the absence of sunlight, there was solidarity. And though hunger left scars, in bodies, in memories, in the pages of old letters, it also left lessons that lasted long after the frost had melted. People learned that survival is not just a matter of food or warmth. It is a matter of will, the quiet, persistent will to begin again even when the world seems to have forgotten how to be. Why the time true summer returned in 1818, the earth had recovered. Crops grew strong once more. Birds returned to the skies. Rivers flowed freely. But the people who lived through the year without a summer would never again take warmth for granted. They had seen how thin the line was between comfort and crisis, and how quickly it could vanish beneath the clouds. For generations, they would speak of 1816 with a mix of awe and disbelief. They would remember the taste of bread made from bark, the sight of snow in June, and the sound of rain that never ended. And yet, when they told those stories, there was always something more, a quiet pride in having survived what seemed impossible. That pride, passed from one voice to another, is perhaps the real legacy of the year without a summer. Proof that even when the world turns cold, people find warmth in each other. When the skies darkened in 1816, the world changed quietly. No battles were fought, no empires fell overnight, and yet, within a single year, the rhythm of life on Earth shifted. The chill that had begun with Mount Tambara's eruption reached every continent, shaping not just weather, but the course of history. The cold began in Asia. Across India, the familiar pulse of the monsoon rains faltered. Clouds came late, and when they came, they failed to pour. Rivers that should have flooded ran shallow, leaving fields cracked and dry. In Bengal, the rice crop withered. In southern India, famine followed. Local reports from the time speak of a sky without mercy. The lack of rain rippled outward. Prices rose, food dwindled, and disease followed hunger. In Yunnan, China, where the mountains catch the moisture of the summer monsoon, drought turned to desperation. Villages abandoned their fields, and people moved north in search of food. The disruption of one season changed entire regions for years. Further east, in China's heartlands, another tragedy unfolded. With failed crops came locusts, drawn to what little survived. Swarms devoured the remaining grain. Local records from 1816 mention three pests together: frost, drought, and hunger. In Europe, the crisis took a different shape. There, it was not drought, but endless rain that brought ruin. Rivers overflowed. Roads washed away. The Rhine and Danube, heavy with constant floodwaters, destroyed bridges and farms alike. In England, meadows became swamps. In France, lowland fields turned to lakes. The very abundance of water became a burden. Across Germany and Switzerland, the result was economic collapse. Factories dependent on water power stood idle when rivers flooded. Mills stopped turning, weavers could not work, and miners could not transport coal through the mud. Entire industries halted, not from war or politics, but from weather. In the cities, bread prices rose until even the middle class felt the strain. In Switzerland, some towns introduced ration cards to prevent hoarding. In Vienna, bakeries were looted. In northern Italy, bands of hungry peasants roamed the countryside, begging or stealing food. The word hunger jar, the year of hunger, entered local language and stayed there for generations. In Ireland, where poverty had already been common, the cold deepened hardship. Potatoes rotted in soaked ground. Families burned turf and driftwood to survive the chill. In parts of the West, people left their homes altogether, crossing the Atlantic in search of a warmer fate. Those small migrations, unnoticed then, would become the early threads of a much larger movement in the years to come. Across the ocean, the United States felt its own share of the strange year. Frost struck New England again and again, each time killing the young corn before it could grow. Farmers in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine saw their fields turn barren and made a difficult choice: to leave. They packed their wagons and headed westward, toward the Ohio Valley, Illinois, and the frontier lands of the Great Lakes. The roads that year were full of quiet caravans, families seeking land where summer still existed. That migration changed the American map. Entire towns were founded by those who had fled the cold. Vermont lost more than 10% of its population in 2 years. Ohio gained thousands. In Canada, snow fell as late as July. The St. Lawrence River froze twice in 1 year. The effects rippled into trade. Ships could not navigate, merchants lost cargo, and ports lay empty. For the indigenous peoples of North America, the consequences were severe but often unrecorded. Many communities relied on hunting seasons and stored food that failed to replenish. The cold disrupted migration patterns of animals and froze rivers that had been pathways for generations. Survival meant adaptation, hunting further, traveling longer, relying on community ties that had sustained them for centuries. In South America, far from the epicenter, the story was the same but reversed. Heavy rainfall and unseasonal chill affected crops in the Andes. In Peru and Colombia, frost damaged coffee and maize. Even the Great Amazon, known for its constant green, saw low temperatures that stunned its tropical life. The entire planet seemed to shift by a fraction, not enough to destroy it, but enough to remind humanity of its fragility. Economists of the time struggled to explain the sudden collapse of markets. The Napoleonic Wars had just ended, and peace was supposed to bring prosperity. Instead, the cold year deepened Europe's post-war depression. Food shortages caused inflation, but trade slowed because transport had become impossible. It was as if the world had won peace, only to lose stability. Governments acted as best they could. In Britain, Parliament passed temporary relief measures. In Prussia, the king ordered emergency grain imports from Poland and Russia. But even with aid, hunger reached places where it had not been known for generations. Meanwhile, scientists began to take note. They did not yet understand volcanology or atmospheric chemistry, but they observed patterns. The British physician and amateur meteorologist Luke Howard, who first classified clouds, wrote detailed reports of the strange weather. He noted that the air possesses an unaccountable opacity, and that the blue of the sky has turned to white. His calm observations, written in London, described the same haze that stretched from Asia to America, proof, though not yet understood, of a single planetary event. Painters too noticed the change. Joseph Mallord William Turner, the English artist known for his landscapes, captured the red and orange skies of the period. His sunsets, vibrant and ghostly, became a visual record of Tambora's ash in the atmosphere. What people saw as beauty was, in fact, the lingering breath of a volcano. In literature, the gloom found its way into imagination. That same summer, on the shores of Lake Geneva, Mary Shelley began her novel Frankenstein, inspired by the constant rain and thunder outside her window. The storm became a metaphor for human creation and destruction, themes not unlike those hidden in the story of Tambora itself. In the quiet spaces of history, the effects were even more lasting. The hunger of 1816 inspired new interest in agricultural reform. Scientists began experimenting with hardier crops, seeking plants that could survive colder climates. In parts of Europe, farmers turned increasingly to the potato, whose resilience in poor soil made it a dependable choice for the uncertain years ahead. Governments, too, learned lessons that would echo into the modern age. The idea of keeping national grain reserves, food stored for times of crisis, took root in this period. The notion that weather could have political consequences was no longer abstract. The sky, once thought eternal, had proven it could influence the fate of nations. Even in art and science, the legacy of 1816 lingered. The unusual sunsets painted by Turner influenced the Romantic movement. The study of atmospheric change eventually led to modern meteorology. The idea that one volcanic event could affect the entire world laid the groundwork for our understanding of global climate systems. The cold also reshaped migration patterns in subtle ways. In Europe, rural poverty pushed many to seek opportunity abroad. In America, the movement westward accelerated. Communities that formed during those years became the seeds of new states and economies. What began as a year of loss quietly built the foundations of growth elsewhere. When scientists today examine ice cores from Greenland, they find in them the same thin gray layer that marks the eruption of Tambora, a silent witness to 1815. But they also find evidence of recovery, a slow return of warmth, a restoration of normal patterns. The Earth healed, as it always does, though the memory remained in its layers. Looking back, the global consequences of 1816 can be traced not only through numbers and data, but through emotion. It was a year that humbled humanity, a reminder that the world, vast as it is, can be changed by a single event far beyond our reach. And yet, in that humility, there was something profoundly human. Out of the cold came invention, cooperation, and reflection. People rebuilt, replanted, and reimagined their world. The hardships of that single year reshaped the decades that followed. The year without a summer ended, but its echo lasted long after. It changed weather patterns, art, science, and even migration. It taught a quiet truth that every civilization eventually learns, that the sky above us, so familiar and dependable, is not unchangeable, and that when it does change, it changes everything below. The Earth's memory is long, and so is ours. When we speak of 1816 today, we do not speak of loss alone. We speak of the world learning to adapt, of fields replanted, skies studied, and minds awakened to the scale of nature's reach. That it was the coldest summer in history, but it warmed humanity's understanding of itself. By the time the year 1816 began to fade into memory, the world had changed in quiet, invisible ways. The cold had taken harvests, the hunger had taken health, and yet, through it all, people endured. In every town and village, in every home where the fire burned low, small acts of resilience shaped the rhythm of survival. History often records the grand gestures, the governments, the decrees, the disasters, but it is the smaller moments, the ones that happened in silence, that reveal how humanity truly survives. In Switzerland, where snow lay thick on the ground in the middle of July, families turned to the lakes. They fished through ice-cold waters, pulling out perch and trout to dry in the wind. Those fish became their lifeline through the long months when nothing grew. Women collected pine needles and boiled them to make bitter tea rich in what they called strength for the blood. Children gathered wood and moss to sell for a few coins, enough to buy a handful of flour. In England's countryside, farmers who had once worked alone began sharing tools and labor. They formed small groups, neighbors, friends, even former rivals, who rotated through each other's fields to save what could still be saved. They worked slowly and quietly under a sun that gave little warmth, driven not by hope of profit, but by the shared belief that survival was easier together. Letters from that summer tell stories that rarely reached the pages of textbooks. In one from Devon, a widow wrote to her sister, "We have made bread from what little we can find, peas and oats ground together. It is not pleasant, but it is food, and it keeps the children alive. The neighbors bring wood, and we share the fire." In France, markets that once sold fine produce became places of barter. People traded candles for potatoes, fabric for grain, a day's labor for a bowl of soup. A blacksmith in Burgundy offered repairs for food instead of money, saying simply, "Metal will wait, hunger will not." In Germany, schools closed not for lack of students, but for lack of food. Yet teachers still gathered children in small groups, teaching them songs and stories to distract from hunger. Some villages organized evening gatherings where people read aloud, just to keep spirits alive through the endless rain. Even in cities, where life was harder and hunger sharper, community replaced isolation. In Vienna, artists sold sketches to raise funds for bread. In London, poor families crowded into makeshift shelters, sharing heat from coal braziers. A diary from the time reads, "We burn together and sleep together. The cold has made us kind." That kindness, quiet as it was, became one of the great unrecorded strengths of the year without a summer that I in Ireland. Where the storms hit hardest, stories spread of coastal families keeping strangers alive. Fishermen who caught a little more than they needed left portions at the doors of those who had none. In one small town in County Cork, a baker who could no longer afford flour gave his ovens freely to anyone who managed to gather grain. It was a small thing, but in times of cold, warmth often begins with such gestures that in North America. 2. Survival came through cooperation. When the frost ruined crops in New England, communities formed food-sharing circles. Families took turns preparing meals for the weakest, the elderly, widows, orphans. When no one had enough, they divided what little they had into smaller pieces. Farmers helped each other rebuild barns and shelters destroyed by ice storms. In Vermont, one diary notes that people gathered in the evenings, not to celebrate, but to sing. They called it keeping the night warm. Out of hardship came innovation. In Germany, scientists began experimenting with alternative flours made from chestnuts and rye. In France, chemists tested preservation techniques that would later influence modern canning. In England, farmers started storing grain underground to protect it from rot. Necessity became the quiet engine of progress, but endurance was not only physical, it was also emotional. The loss of sunlight affected people deeply. Days blurred into one another, gray and endless. Yet, out of that gloom, reflection grew. Writers, poets, and thinkers began to look inward. Mary Shelley, Lord Byron, and Percy Shelley, trapped by the cold and storms at Lake Geneva, wrote not only of monsters and darkness, but of creation, life, and resilience. Even their gloom carried traces of curiosity, proof that the human mind can transform despair into meaning. In the countryside, people found comfort in routine. They repaired tools, mended clothes, and counted supplies. Every small task was a declaration of intent that life, no matter how hard, would go on. In letters from Germany, one farmer wrote, "We rise, we work, we eat, we sleep. It is not joy, but it is order, and order keeps us alive." As months passed, and the skies remained stubbornly cold, people began to notice signs that not all was lost. In September, a few late patches of wheat survived in sheltered valleys. In some regions of France and Italy, the vineyards bore a tiny harvest, enough to prove that the earth, though wounded, still lived. By the end of 1816, the weather began to ease, if only slightly. The frosts became less frequent, the rain less endless. The return of faint warmth was met not with celebration, but with relief. People did not rejoice. They simply exhaled. When the first true spring returned in 1817, there was no festival, no triumph. But there was renewal. Fields were cleared. Seeds saved from the little that had survived was planted again. Families rebuilt their stores, repaired their homes, and counted what they had learned. The hunger had taken much, but it had also left behind lessons about sharing, patience, and the quiet strength that keeps people moving when the world stands still. In Switzerland, a traveler passing through mountain villages noted, "They have little, but their faces are calm. They speak not of the year of hunger, but of the year of endurance." That word, Endurance defined 1816 better than any other. It was not the year without a summer, but the year when humanity refused to surrender to cold. And as the seasons recovered, so too did society. Markets reopened, trade routes revived. People who had migrated returned, carrying with them new ideas and experiences. Farmers rebuilt differently, keeping larger stores for emergencies. Governments began recording weather systematically, the first steps toward what would become modern meteorology. The cold had united people in struggle, but its aftermath united them in curiosity. What had caused such a global chill? Why had it touched every corner of the earth? Those questions led to decades of scientific exploration. Without realizing it, the survivors of 1816 had helped spark humanity's long effort to understand the planet's systems, the invisible threads that connect sky, land, and life. But for those who lived through it, the lessons were simpler. They learned the value of community, of saving for lean times, of kindness offered freely. They discovered that hope does not depend on warmth or comfort, but on the belief that tomorrow, somehow, will come when the sun finally returned in full strength. The people of Europe and America noticed how bright it seemed. The colors looked sharper, the air felt warmer than memory. Perhaps it was only perception, or perhaps hardship makes gratitude deeper. In the decades that followed, travelers would recall that time with disbelief. The year without a summer, they called it, a phrase that sounds almost poetic. But beneath it lies 1,000 stories of survival that a farmer in Bavaria summed it best in his diary years later. We thought the sun had forgotten us, but it had only gone behind the clouds to see what we would do. That is the story of 1816, not of cold, but of courage, not of darkness, but of quiet light, the kind that comes not from the sky, but from people themselves. The cold year of 1816 eventually passed, but it did not fade without leaving a mark. In every corner of the world, the memory of that lost summer lingered, in diaries, in art, in science, and in policy. Out of frost and hunger, humanity learned lessons it had not expected to face. It learned how fragile the Earth's balance was, and how deeply connected every place on the planet truly is. First, the changes were small and practical. Farmers in Europe and North America began keeping detailed records of weather, not just for curiosity, but for survival. They tracked the timing of frosts, the patterns of rain, and the behavior of animals before storms. From these handwritten logs grew the first networks of meteorological observation. What had once been superstition, the belief that clouds or winds carried omens, became the foundation of science. Governments also took note. The food shortages of 1816 exposed how easily economies could crumble when weather turned against them. In Britain, officials began considering the need for grain reserves, warehouses where wheat could be stored against future shortages. In France and Germany, regional councils set up early forms of agricultural insurance, pooling risk among farmers. These measures were the first quiet steps toward the modern idea of food security. The cold had also changed the map of settlement. In the United States, thousands of families who had fled the frost in New England never returned. They settled permanently in the Midwest, clearing forests and planting new fields. The states of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois grew quickly after 1816, their populations shaped by the migrations of that difficult year. In that sense, the year without a summer helped shape the geography of modern America. In Europe, the hardships of 1816 to 1817 encouraged new thinking about technology and progress. Inventors sought ways to make food more reliable, transport more efficient, and living conditions more stable. Within a generation, the Industrial Revolution accelerated, not only because of ambition, but also because people had seen what fragility looked like. The memory of scarcity made the pursuit of stability more urgent. Art, too, bore the mark of that cold year. Painters such as J.M.W. Turner captured the strange light that filled the skies. the soft oranges, the dusky reds, the filtered glow of the sun through volcanic haze. Those colors, though born of ash, transformed art. They gave rise to new ways of seeing the world, not as a fixed, perfect order, but as a living system of change. Romanticism, that great wave of feeling that swept through 19th century Europe, drew some of its mood from those skies. The sublime became not just beauty, but awe in the face of nature's power. Literature followed the same current. Byron's poem Darkness, written during that summer, imagined a world where the sun had gone out, an echo of the very skies he saw. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, conceived in the same damp months by Lake Geneva, carried within it the shadow of 1816, humanity confronting the limits of creation, the tension between knowledge and responsibility. Even the Gothic imagination that grew in those years can be traced, in part, to the sense of instability the world had felt. Science, too, found new purpose. The strange weather inspired curiosity about how the Earth's atmosphere worked. In Germany, France, and Britain, early meteorologists began measuring temperature and pressure systematically. The idea that one event, a volcano on a distant island, could alter global climate became a subject of fascination. Decades later, scientists would connect Tambara's eruption with the temperature drop of 1816, giving rise to the concept of volcanic winter. That realization changed the way humanity saw its planet. The world was no longer a collection of isolated lands, but a single, interconnected system, one atmosphere, one ocean, one fragile balance. What happened in one place could ripple everywhere. That understanding would shape modern climate science in a way. The people of 1816 had lived through the first known example of global climate disruption. They did not call it that, but they felt it. In empty markets, in pale skies, in the silence of frozen fields. And through that experience, they learned what textbooks would later confirm, that the Earth and humanity share the same breath. The social consequences were no less profound. The hardships revealed the importance of cooperation and empathy. Across Europe, communities that had survived by sharing grain and labor began to see charity not as an act of generosity, but as a form of resilience. The idea that governments and citizens had a shared responsibility to prevent famine gained traction. In time, this would lead to the first public health initiatives and welfare systems. Economically, the crisis underscored the need for diversification. Regions that relied on a single crop, such as Ireland's dependence on potatoes or Switzerland's on grain, suffered most. After 1816, agricultural societies encouraged experimentation with new plants and storage methods. The lessons learned then would later help Europe face other crises, including the potato blight of the 1840s. Even philosophy was touched by the year without a summer. The contrast between human achievement and natural vulnerability became a central theme of the 19th century. Thinkers began to write of progress not as dominance over nature, but as balance within it. The memory of 1816, though distant, influenced how intellectuals and scientists approached the modern world, with both ambition and caution, yet beyond all these tangible effects. The most enduring lesson of 1816 may have been emotional. It reminded people of the thin line between stability and chaos, between confidence and humility. The eruption of a single volcano had dimmed the sun and chilled the air of every continent. Civilization, proud and industrious, had been forced to pause and endure, but when warmth returned, it brought not just relief, but perspective. People saw the world differently, as something shared, something delicate, something to be understood rather than assumed, in letters written years later. Survivors still mention the cold with a tone of awe. An English farmer wrote in 1820, "We did not think it possible that the sky itself could betray us, yet we lived through it. We plant earlier now, and we save more, for we know what the earth can forget." In Switzerland, a teacher who had kept his students fed through 1816 wrote simply, "I do not trust the sun, but I thank it when it comes." Those words captured a new realism, not fear, but awareness. Humanity had been reminded that its greatest strength lies not in control, but in adaptation. Modern scientists still study Tambara's impact, not only to understand the past, but to predict the future. Its legacy is found in the data we now collect, in the satellites that watch the sky, in the warnings that help prevent famine. In that sense, the cold year of 1816 was the beginning of a long conversation, one between humanity and the planet it inhabits. When we look back on that year now, we see not only suffering, but transformation. The darkness sparked innovation. The hardship taught cooperation. The frost inspired art, and the silence inspired science. Out of absence, presence grew. The lesson of 1816 endures because it is universal. It tells us that even when the world seems unyielding, we adapt. We learn. We remember. The sun that failed to shine that year eventually returned. The fields grew again. The rivers thawed. The people rebuilt. Yet the experience remained like a shadow in collective memory, a quiet reminder that every comfort is temporary, every certainty fragile, and perhaps that is the real gift of history. It teaches without punishing. If we are willing to listen, the people of 1816 had no answers, but they left us wisdom in their endurance. They showed that progress is not only invention or discovery, it is also patience, compassion, and the courage to begin again when the sky turns gray. More than 2 centuries later, when the world faces its own challenges, storms, droughts, changes in climate, the story of the year without a summer still whispers across time. It tells us that resilience is ancient, that adaptation is inherited, and that hope, though quiet, outlasts even the longest winter. The cold of 1816 passed, but the lessons it left have never faded. They live in every farmer who studies the weather, every scientist who measures the air, and every person who, when faced with hardship, chooses to endure rather than surrender, because in the end, that is what history truly is. Not just what happened, but how people kept going when it did. The skies are clear now. The fields that once froze in midsummer have long since turned green again. The rivers that carried the memory of hunger now flow quietly. And the winds that once carried ash carry nothing more than the scent of rain and earth. The year without a summer has passed into history, yet its silence still speaks. It reminds us that even when the world darkens, people continue. They plan again. They share again. They hope again to in 1816. The sun seemed to disappear. But humanity did not. It adapted. It learned. And it endured. The story of that cold, forgotten year is not one of despair, but of strength. The quiet kind that never makes headlines, but shapes everything that follows. The same patience that kept families alive through endless gray skies still lives in us today. The same curiosity that asked, "Why did this happen?" became the science that now watches the clouds. History is not only the tale of what we build, but of what we survive. It is in the frost-covered fields, the empty markets, the flicker of firelight on long nights, and the decision, repeated over and over, to keep going. If you listen closely, you can still feel that year breathing beneath the surface of time, a reminder that warmth returns, even after the coldest season. So, as you drift into rest tonight, let the noise of history fade into calm. Let the lessons of the past settle softly in your thoughts, not as warnings, but as comfort, because everything that endured once before can endure again. And if this quiet journey through history helped you find a moment of peace tonight, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Boring History for Sleep. There are many more nights and many more stories, each waiting quietly, just beyond the horizon of memory. Good night, and sleep well.